Tēnā koutou katoa, bom dia, bonjour, buenos dias, assalamu alaikum, ni hao, welcome everybody. My name is Talia Keogh-Rowden. I'm coming to you from Wellington, New Zealand, here in Aotearoa at the bottom of the world. I hope that over the next hour you will have a chance to get used to my accent. I'm delighted to be joined today by two of my colleagues who will introduce themselves also. So we have Tori and Mena. Tori, can I hand over to you and then to Mena?
Sure, thanks Talia. Hi everyone, I'm Tori. I'm from Canada and I'm coming to you today from Liverpool, United Kingdom, and I'm Hermi's Strategy and Communication Officer.
And Mena.
Hello everyone. My name is Minna. I am based in the United States, and my parents are both from Egypt. So really excited to get to talk to everyone today. Our presentation will be in English, but if you, I do speak Arabic, so if you prefer to ask questions in Arabic, you are welcome to do so. For our Arabic speakers, أهلا وسهلا. أنا سعيدة جدا إن أنتوا قدرتوا تكونوا معانا هنا النهاردة. أنا اسمي منى، أنا عايشة في أمريكا ولكن أهلي من مصر. زي ما أنا قلت النهاردة حوارنا هيكون بالإنجليزي، ولكن لو حد يفضل إن هو يسأل أسئلته بالعربي ممكن تعملوا كده، وأنا سعيدة إن أنا أرد عليهم. فشكرا جدا إن أنتم معانا النهاردة.
Thank you, Tori. Thanks, Mena. So, as I said, my name is Talia Keogh-Rowden. I'm the Strategy and Communication Lead for the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, or Hermi, as we call ourselves for short. I'm coming to you today, or tonight in my case, from Wellington, New Zealand, where it's 10 p.m. I hope you can get used to my accent as we go through. And we also have, as well as Tori and Mena, we have Catherine Chong behind the scenes. She may put some useful information in the chat box as we go along. A reminder that we're recording this session and it will be available on our YouTube channel after the workshop, probably next week by the time we pop it up. We will be glad to answer any questions that you have about our data or anything along the way. Please put your questions in the chat box. We will either be able to give you a quick written response while other things are happening in the session, or we will save your question for discussion later on. Please all keep your audio muted until we come to the question session. Thank you all for being here. We're really pleased to have this opportunity to talk together about what we are doing here at Hermi. So now I'm going to share my screen. A few things before we begin, just to remind you that we're recording and that you can put your questions in the chat box and keep your audio muted. So a little bit about us before we get into the data that we produce. Importantly, we use co-design in everything we do. We work together with all kinds of people who are interested in human rights and measuring them to come up with the best systems for doing that. So when we decided to fill the measurement gap that exists, we started by having co-design workshops that brought together human rights practitioners from all over the world and academics, specialists in measuring human rights to find out what questions we needed to ask, find out what information people wanted and how to present the information so that it would be useful. And everything we do carries on in that spirit. We are always trying to improve. So whenever you have any feedback on our work, we would love to hear it, to hear your suggestions, to hear things that don't work for you, that you think that could be better to be more useful. And we are just constantly changing and improving because of feedback and participation from people all over the world. We are a diverse global team. We have people working with Hermi from all over the world, and you'll see today that I'm coming from New Zealand. Mena is an Egyptian American coming from America, and Tori is a Canadian coming from the UK. And we're delighted to have people in this workshop today from all over the world. The research that we do is peer-reviewed. It's important to us that it's accepted by the human rights practitioner community and also by the academic community. And so we do have peer-reviewed articles and other academic scholarship, where the academic community has agreed that what we are doing is robust and reliable and useful. And crucially, we are independent of all governments, and we are not for profit. All of the work that we produce is freely available to all of you. You can use anything that you find on either of our websites and use it in your work without, asking for extra permission or anything like that. And we are independent of all governments. We're not part of the United Nations setup either. So there is nobody who's telling us what to say, and nobody that we're listening to apart from our human rights stakeholder communities. So we are here to give objective and independent information about how countries are doing in the human rights performance. We do what we do because we believe that what gets measured gets improved. We believe that what gets measured gets improved. It's very difficult to argue for improvements in your country if the thing that you're arguing about is not being accurately measured. So we want to provide measurement tools to all sorts of other people around the world who can use them to improve people's lives. Our goal at Hermi is to eventually measure all human rights that appear in international law. And we have begun with two main sets of human rights. We've begun with 5 economic and social rights. And for those rights, the rights to education, food, health, housing, and work, we have scores on our rights tracker for around 195 countries, at least some of those scores for all of those countries. For our civil and political rights measurements, we measure 8 different civil and political rights. It is more resource intensive, as we will talk about later on in the session, to measure those rights. So we so far have scores for 39 countries, and we increase that number every year. So our goal is certainly to have full world coverage for all of those rights, and then also to expand into other rights. So we're beginning to look into measuring child rights under the CRC or UNCROC, to measure the rights of disabled persons, to measure the rights of Indigenous people, to measure the rights of women, using all of the different United Nations instruments. So we've begun with these 2 sets, and we are gradually expanding. To tell you a little bit more about how and why we measure these things, for our 5 economic and social rights, we measure progressive realisation, and that's our point of difference. When it comes to the right to food, many different organisations can tell you something useful about food security or hunger or famine in a country. What we can tell you is whether the government of the country is upholding its own human rights obligations, whether it's doing as much as it ought to and as much as it can right now. So we start with data in those international databases on things like food security in a country, but then we also take a country's income into account. So we can make a calculation of whether the country could right now afford to be doing more, or whether it is doing the best it possibly can with the income it has. And so we are measuring government performance at progressively realising these rights. For our 8 civil and political rights, we do something quite different. We have a completely different methodology. There are no international databases that have reliable data on these things in a way that we can compare across countries. And so we go straight to the source. We go to people like many of you here, people who are experts in monitoring human rights in a particular country, and we ask them what the situation is for each of these rights. And we do it using sophisticated survey techniques that mean that we can compare scores and judgments from one person to another and from one country to another. Now, this is resource intensive, and so we're covering some of the world and we're getting more each time. So we are the first to measure respect for these rights, to put a number on the performance of each country. Obviously, there are many wonderful organisations who are monitoring human rights and reporting on violations of human rights. We put a number to the government's performance that can be tracked over time to show improvement and deterioration. We use a secure, anonymous online survey of in-country human rights experts to do this. And we work with around 40 countries now, and next year we're very excited to be adding China and India, and that's going to mean that we are reporting on the human rights experiences of over half the world's population. So we're very grateful to be able to do that. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tori, who's going to talk a little bit more about our economic and social rights, how we measure them and why, and what you'll be able to see on the rights tracker for yourself. So over to you, Tori.
Thanks, Talia. So as Talia said, I'm going to show you our economic and social rights data. And I'll start by showing you a video from our YouTube channel, which gives a really good quick overview of the data that we have.
Human rights release human potential. How do we tell if countries...
Well, that's looking good and sounding great. It's just buffering. So we'll take a minute while it does.
That's strange.
You should feel free to refresh your screen, to maybe stop sharing and refresh it, Tori, while there's always going to be an unexpected gremlin. We've tested this more than once, but of course, you never know what will happen with technology. A reminder that as you hear Tori and then Minna talk about what our rights tracker shows, any questions that you have, do feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll answer some of them as we go in writing, and we'll address some of them in conversation at the end of the presentations. So please do feel free to ask questions. We're very happy to receive them.
Okay, let's try the video again. Hopefully it works.
Human rights release human potential. How do we tell if countries are respecting people's human rights and allowing them to flourish? If we want leaders to prioritize human rights, we need to measure them. What gets measured gets improved. Leaders of countries love numbers. What's GDP growth this quarter? How many people are out of a job? But do leaders have all the most important numbers? The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, Hermi, is filling a gap in the human rights ecosystem. We use award-winning and peer-reviewed methodologies to track the human rights performance of countries and publish scores each year on our rights tracker. We want countries to strive to climb to the top, to do their very best. We want leaders to call in their advisors and ask what they need to do to get their human rights scores up. But where is the top? When it comes to the rights to education, food, health, housing, and work, what target should a country aim for, especially when every country has a different level of income to spend? International human rights law says that every country needs to do their very best to devote their maximum available resources to improving their people's quality of life. This is called progressive realization. Hermi's scores are the first in the world to measure progressive realization, so countries at any level of income can know how well they're doing and have a realistic target to aim for, a goal they're capable of reaching. We discover the realistic target by finding out which countries have the best results at every level of income and comparing each country to that benchmark. We do it like this. Let's take the percentage of young people enrolled in secondary school in every country around the world. We take all the results for the last 20 years and plot them on this graph. Each dot is one country's result for 1 year. There's a big range. At any level of income, for rich countries and poor ones, there are some places that are setting the target, doing the best we've ever seen, and some that are a long way behind. How close to the target is a country getting? That's the Hermi score, given as a percentage of the target. Every country should be able to get near its 100% target. The lower the score, the more urgent the need for improvement. A low-income country getting 100% will most likely need more resources to improve its people's lives further. You can take these scores to government leaders. Show Guatemala's government that they are far behind other countries with the same level of wealth, even among their local neighbors. Show Malaysia that at their high level of income, they could achieve so much more. You can even combine our scores with population data to show, for instance, that if Guatemala went from its current score to the target of 100%, over 1 million extra young people would be in secondary school. Human rights release human potential and let people flourish. You can harness the power of Hermi's economic and social rights scores to fuel your country's climb to the top, its quest to be its very best. Go to rightstracker.org now.
Great, so following from that, we're going to go to rightstracker.org now. I'll show you a few countries, what this data looks like on our rights tracker, and then how it can be useful.
The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, and I'd like to give you a short demonstration of how to use our rights tracker.
Okay, are you currently seeing the rights tracker? Yes. Okay, excellent. So this is the home page of the rights tracker, and there are a few different ways you can navigate the page. So you can search by right, by country, and by people group. I'm going to start by searching by country, and I'll type in Zimbabwe. So this takes you to the at a glance page, and to see more detail for our economic and social rights, you'll click on quality of life. So Hermi measures 5 quality of life rights: the right to education, food, health, housing, and work. And then when we have a score for all 5 of these rights, we can calculate an overall quality of life summary score, which is the score that you see here. So as the video talked about, what these scores are measuring is progressive realization. So when we look at this score on the right to health, it says 84.2%. This does not mean that 84.2% of people in Zimbabwe enjoy their right to health. It means that Zimbabwe is currently achieving 84.2% of what Hermi has calculated to be possible at its current level of income. And what we also saw in that video is that the 100% target is set by what has already been achieved by countries at a similar level of income. So we know that this is a realistic and achievable target. But what happens if your country scores 100% on a right that you know may not actually be well respected, and you want your leaders to know that there's a lot more work to be done? So I'll show you another country to illustrate this. So I'll go to countries and I'll type in Malawi. So Malawi here is scoring 100% on the right to health. Again, this does not mean that 100% of people in Malawi enjoy the right to health. It means that Malawi is currently achieving 100% of what it could be expected to do at its current level of income. And so they are meeting their international obligation of realizing these rights to the maximum of their available resources. But as a human rights advocate in Malawi, you may not want to tell your government that they're scoring 100% if you know maybe there's a lot more progress to be made. So in this case, rather than looking at our income adjusted Hermi score, you can look at the global best score. So you do that by clicking on switch view here. And it will ask you which performance benchmark. So the income adjusted benchmark is the default on our rights tracker, which is the one which shows progressive realization. The global best benchmark shows you how well this country is performing against all of the countries in the world, including the wealthiest countries. So if we look at this, it's currently 100% under income adjusted. And then when we go to global best, the score has changed to 74.4%, which is falling within the very bad to bad range. This shading at the bottom is just to give you an idea of how to interpret the score, since anything below about 100% is not meeting the obligation under the income adjusted score. When you're looking at global best and you see that the number is going down from 100%, that's showing you that Malawi is probably income constrained and that these resource constraints are stopping it from fully realizing these rights for its people. So I'll go back to income adjusted. Remember that you need to switch back to income adjusted manually. That's the default setting, and it won't show you the next page in income adjusted unless you switch it back. So if you're looking at a country that's scoring 100% on our rights tracker, that's the kind of number you can use to say that in order to achieve or to increase the realization of that right, they probably need additional resources. But this score here on 38.2% under income adjusted, that means Malawi is only doing 38.2% of what it could be doing with its current resources. And so they already have the resources to improve their performance on this right. Now I'll exit out of here and I'll show you another country to show you a bit more of the data that we use to calculate these rights. So I'll go to countries again and I'll type in United Kingdom. And I'll go to quality of life again. So at the top, we have the overview, which is what we were just looking at. And then below this, we have this section of quality of life, full details. And this shows you a bit more of what we use to calculate each right. So I'll show you here the right to housing first. So at the top is the right to housing. It's good to know that our rights tracker is very interactive. So as you're going through, if you ever have questions, you can usually just click on something to get some more information. So if we click on the right to housing here, we can see how this human right is defined, what aspects of this right we measure, and then the data sources for underlying indicators, where our data sources are generally data from international databases. So I'll exit out of this now. So the right to housing for the United Kingdom is calculated using data on affordable housing and safely managed sanitation. It's important to note here that these are also Hermi scores. So again, this is not saying that 49.7% of people in the United Kingdom have access to affordable housing. It's saying that the United Kingdom is currently achieving 49.7% of what it could be expected to do. So you can use these in your advocacy if you're reporting on, for example, a more specific topic like safely managed sanitation. And then it's also good to know that if you want to see the data that we use to calculate this, you can click on indicator values. And then now, instead of seeing an income adjusted score, you're seeing the percentage of people, for example, who have access to affordable housing and safely managed sanitation. And I'll go back to Hermi scores. And then I'll also show you, we do have a switch view option for this section of the rights tracker as well. That can be quite helpful. So I'll show you the right to work to illustrate this. So for the United Kingdom, they're receiving a 61.2% on the right to work. And that is based on scores for a right to a fair income and a right to a job. So 61.2% is a very bad score. If we click on the switch view option here, you can see below where it asks for the performance benchmark, it also asks you which assessment standard. So since the UK is a high income country, their default assessment standard is high income. And when you change the assessment standard, it changes these scores, which we use to calculate the overall score. So remember, the UK is getting 61.2% here on the high income assessment standard. When I click on low and middle income, it's now going to 99.4%. And that score is calculated with the right to subsistence income. So that uses data on absolute poverty. So if we use absolute poverty as the only indicator for all of the countries that we calculate a right to work score for, then high income countries like the United Kingdom would all be scoring very high, and we wouldn't actually be seeing the differences between their performance and then also how much improvement they actually have that they could be making. So I'll switch back to the high income assessment standard. That's one reason that we have different assessment standards, is to make sure that the scores are comparable and most relevant. The other reason that we have different assessment standards is that just some indicators are more available for low and middle income countries than for high income countries, or vice versa. So I'll go to the right to education. So for a high income country, the right to education is calculated using the right to secondary education, and then the right to a quality education, which these quality education scores are used based on the PISA test score. So it's standardized tests. And those standardized tests are not run in every low and middle income country. So we don't have those scores available for every country. But it is important to know that you can switch view because Hermi calculates a score for wherever there is data available. So if we switch view, if you're on a low and middle income country and you'd like to see their scores for quality education and they run the PISA test, you can switch assessment standard and you can see the score there. For the United Kingdom, if I go to low and middle income assessment standard, then we can see that based on the low and middle income assessment standard, the right to education is taking into account primary education as well. So it's good to know that you can switch view just so that you're seeing the most complete data that we have, especially if some examples are more relevant to the work that you're doing than others. Again, I'll go back to the high income assessment standard. I always stress that you need to switch back manually because I often forget myself. I'll exit out of here. And then I'll show you one more country to show you the other features on this page. So again, in the country view, I'll type in Angola. I'll go to quality of life. So we've seen the overview and we've seen the full details. Then below this, then we have our sex segregated data. We have this for a few rights. So the right to education, the right to food, and the right to health. What's important to understand about this section is that these are also Hermi scores. So these are really useful to tell you how well your country is meeting its international obligation for females and how well it is meeting its international obligation for males. So this would be particularly useful for people who are doing work on gender to see those disparities for the realization of rights for females or for males. And then next, we have the overtime graph. This is a good section to go to if you're looking for a bit of good news, because this is often where we can see some incremental improvements. So as an example here, I believe I was looking at the right to housing. Yeah. So in 2007, Angola scored at 24.5% on the right to housing, which is quite a low score. And then 2018, they're receiving 40%. So they still have quite a long way to go to meet their international obligation, but we are seeing a clear improvement over time, which is good to point to show that we really are seeing that improvement. And then we just need to keep that momentum going and maybe increase it as well. And then finally, on our quality of life page is the people at risk data, which we only have available for the 39 countries where we run our survey. So we don't have this for every country that we have economic and social rights data for. And Menna is going to talk more about our survey. So I'll stop sharing now and she can give you a bit more detail about this kind of stuff.
Yes, thank you so much, Tori. And yeah, I'm excited now to get to talk about our civil and political rights data. So I'm going to start us off with a quick video that's going to provide kind of a broad overview of how Hermi measures civil and political rights data. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And if you'll please let me know if you're able to see the video.
We can see your screen and it's just buffering.
Perfect, okay.
Human rights keep people safe and let them flourish. How do we tell if all countries are respecting people's rights and allowing them to flourish? If we want leaders to prioritize human rights, we need to measure them. What gets measured gets improved. Leaders of countries love numbers. What's GDP growth this quarter? How many people have jobs? The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, Hermi, is filling a gap in the human rights ecosystem. We use robust and peer-reviewed methodologies to track the human rights performance of countries and publish scores each year on our rights tracker. We are shining a light on human rights. We want countries to care so much about human rights that leaders call in their advisors and ask what they need to do to get their scores up. Civil and political rights, like voting rights, free speech, and freedom from torture and ill treatment, haven't been measured comprehensively until now, partly because it's unpopular with governments, and partly because of the desk drawer problem. People with accurate knowledge about, say, how many people were tortured last year often have bulging desk drawers, but lots of the cases they know about don't end up being published or counted. Maybe there isn't enough funding, or their organization has different priorities right now. So we go straight to those local experts in each country, and we ask them about the rights we measure, given all the information in their desk drawers. We want to produce reliable scores that are comparable between different people across different countries over time. So we use a carefully designed, anonymous, and secure online questionnaire to find out what's really going on in each country. We ask about what people have observed in their country, and also about fictional countries, so we can place everyone's answers on the same scale. Then we act as a megaphone, amplifying the voices of all of those local researchers, campaigners, human rights lawyers, and journalists. Our megaphone turns their combined desk drawer knowledge into scores out of 10 for each country, displayed and freely available to the worldonrightstracker.org. We display scores within certainty bands. The narrower the band, the more certain we are of the score. We also ask everyone which kinds of people are at extra risk of having their rights violated, so you can search the rights tracker to explore the human rights situation for, say, refugees, or women and girls, or journalists, or people who are homeless. Please use your country's scores to advocate for the changes you want. Show your leaders the numbers and where they need to improve. Congratulate them when you see the scores go up. We publish annual updates each year, usually in June. Go to rightstracker.org to see how your country is doing. You can also get in touch if you want us to bring the survey to your country, or if you can help fund us to keep producing these data and expand our coverage. In today's world, change needs numbers, and we are producing them, because human rights keep people safe and let them flourish. The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, measuring what matters.
All right, so while we're still on the video, there is one thing I'd like to bring to your attention, which is that we have translated this video into a number of different languages. So if you go on the settings of the video, click on subtitles, you're able to select from a number of different languages, if that'll make it easier for you to look at the video. And I believe that this video link will also be put in the chat box. So I'm going to minimize this video, and I'm going to take us to the rights tracker. Are you guys able to see the rights tracker? Perfect. All right, so the video touched on a number of important aspects to understanding how Hermi measures civil and political rights. And I think one of the biggest things that it touches on is that unlike quality of life, our civil and political rights data is coming from an expert survey that we run in about 40 countries. As Talia was mentioning earlier, running the survey in a country is pretty resource intensive. And so while our ultimate goal is to be able to have civil and political rights data for every country, right now we have civil and political rights data for about 40. So if you're interested to see if we have civil and political rights data on your country, the easiest thing to do is to come up to the country tab up here, and then to either scroll down to your country or to search for it. So I'm just going to search right here, and I'm going to pull up the Democratic Republic of Congo. All right. So we've had a chance to talk about quality of life, and so now we're going to get into safety from the state. Before I dive any further into this page, I want to take a moment and explain the difference between safety from the state and empowerment. So both safety from the state and empowerment fall under the category of civil and political rights. Safety from the state refers to physical integrity rights. So these are rights that have to do with your bodily safety. We're looking at things like the right to be free from arbitrary arrest or the right to be free from torture. Empowerment has to do with your ability to express your opinion, to participate in government, or to assemble and associate. So those are kind of the different categories that they both are considered civil and political rights, and they both rely on the expert survey. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit to get us into the safety from the state tab. So the safety from the state tab, the first thing that we see is this summary score right here. This is very similar to the summary score that Tori talked about earlier for quality of life, in that it is a summary of all the scores that we have for the rights that fall under this category. So here, the summary score is a reflection of the average of the scores for the right to be free from arbitrary arrest, the right to be free from forced disappearance, the right to be free from the death penalty, the right to be free from extrajudicial execution, and the right to be free from torture and maltreatment. If you're ever looking at a country and you notice that we don't have a summary score, that is likely because we don't have a score for one of the rights that make up that section. So I'm going to keep us moving and get into a little bit more detail about the scores that we have for each individual right. And I'm going to focus on arbitrary arrest. So you see here that if you are able to bring your cursor here, you can see the score that we have given that country. So we see here that for the right to be free from arbitrary arrest, DRC gets a score of 3.8. You also see that there is a kind of purple shaded area. These are what we call the uncertainty bands that were referenced in the video. So the best way to interpret this score would be to say that we calculate that DRC's score for its respect to be free from arbitrary arrest is 3.8. And at the same time, we also know that the true score could be anywhere in this range. So the true score could be anywhere between 3.0 and 4.5. And so this applies to how you interpret all of the uncertainty bands for each score. Another thing that I would like to bring to your attention is that we see that DRC receives a score of 10 on the death penalty. For countries that receive a score of 10 on the death penalty, that is usually an indication that they have either banned the death penalty and have accepted international law banning the death penalty. They may have a domestic law banning the death penalty, or the death penalty may not be banned, but it may no longer be in use. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. I'd like to bring to your attention to these two sentences that we have here. So these sentences are provided to help you get kind of a little bit help in terms of interpreting the scores that are on the rights tracker. So the first sentence here says that DRC safety from the state score is 4.3 out of 10. And that suggests that many people are not safe from one or more of the following, and then it lists all the rights that make up safety from the state. The second sentence usually allows you to compare this country's performance to other countries in the same region. So unfortunately, at this point, we only have data for 4 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so we are comparing DRC to the rest of the countries in our sample. And we see that if we do that, DRC is performing worse than average on the right to be safe from the state. As we've mentioned a couple of times, our ultimate goal is to be able to have data for all countries. And so we ultimately do hope to have more data for countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more and take us to the overtime section of this page. So I think this is a really interesting and unique part of the rights tracker. Using your mouse, you're able to go to a score and you're able to see how it has shifted over time. So we can see that in 2017, DRC received a score of 4.8 on the right to be free from forced disappearance. That dropped to a 4.1 in 2018. It went up again to a 5.3 in 2019, and then it went up again in 2020 to 5.8. So I think this is really interesting for a number of reasons. I think this is a great place to turn if you want to see shifts over time. And I think it can also be a great place to start asking questions about, what possibly changed that caused this score to improve. One thing I would like to note is that for DRC, we do have data over time starting from 2017. For other countries, we may have data starting in 2018 or 2019. That depends on when the country was included in the survey. So as we are expanding and as we are including more countries in our expert survey, that means that we're able to collect more data. And so if you find a country doesn't have scores until like 2019, that just means that it didn't, that we weren't measuring scores in that country until 2019. All right, I'm going to scroll down a little bit more and go to the people at risk section of this page. And so we ask our respondents to identify the specific people groups that were especially vulnerable to facing a violation of a specific right. And so here we can see that we're looking at the data for people who are at risk of violations for the right to be free from arbitrary arrest. If you wanted to change that to look at another right, you'd simply click on this arrow right here and select a different right. I'm going to keep us on arbitrary arrest. And we see that the majority of our respondents picked or said that people engaged in or suspected of political violence were at risk of facing a violation of this right. So a couple of things to note about this word cloud. The larger the text is and the closer it is to the top, the greater the percentage of respondents that identified that group of people as being at risk. You can bring your cursor and kind of highlight or go over that group to see exactly what percentage of our human rights experts identified that group of people as being at particular risk. Here I want to note that 83% does not reflect what percentage of people engaged in or suspected of political violence were at risk. Instead, it is indicating what percentage of our human rights experts identified that group of people as being at risk. So if there is a group of people that maybe our respondents did not identify, that does not necessarily mean that they're not at risk at all. It may mean that they felt that there was another group that was more at risk. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. And so at the bottom, we have what we call qualitative data. And I think this is a really cool and unique part of Hermi and kind of a byproduct of how we measure human rights. So in our survey, we give respondents the opportunity to provide extra context for, what specific people groups were at risk of facing a violation of a right, what was the specific context that they were facing this violation. And so in turn, we get a lot of really rich data that we are able to see because we are asking the people who are in that country and kind of have that firsthand knowledge. So for example, we can see when it comes to the right to be free from arbitrary arrest, that journalists, especially those who were opposing the president in DRC, were particularly at risk. Similarly, we can see that people who are LGBTQIA+, especially those who are young, were also at risk. So this is really rich data, and I think it provides a lot of insight into what is happening in the country. So I highly encourage everyone to take a little bit of time to explore the data, the qualitative data. So that is the end of the Safety from the State page. I'm going to scroll back up. And next, I would like to talk about empowerment rights. Empowerment rights, the presentation of it on the rights tracker, is very similar to the presentation of Safety from the State. So I'm going to shift us over to another country just so we can see data for a different country. So I'm going to go to countries, and then I could scroll down and pick a country, or I could type one. So I'm just going to type one. And I'm going to look at Mozambique. So I'm going to scroll down and go to empowerment rights. So as I stated, the presentation of empowerment rights is very similar to the presentation of safety from the state. There are a few things that I would like to note using this data. So we see that there is, of course, a summary score. One of the things that may catch your attention is the fact that the uncertainty band for opinion and expression is a lot narrower than the uncertainty band for the right to participate in government. So there are two main reasons for this. One option or one possibility is that is the number of respondents that we had. So the more respondents that we have, the narrower the uncertainty band. So it is possible that we got more responses for the right to opinion and expression, and therefore the uncertainty band was narrower. Another option is that there was more variety in the answers that we received from respondents when it came to participation in government. So maybe when it came to the right to participate in government, our respondents kind of gave different answers. Whereas for the right to opinion expression, all of our respondents gave very similar answers, and therefore we had a narrower uncertainty band. Another thing that I would like to take a moment and talk about is kind of these categories at the bottom: very bad, bad, fair, and good. So once again, similar to the way that the quality of life data is presented, these categories are aimed to give you a little bit of help in terms of understanding the scores. But one thing that I would like to emphasize is that these scores are out of 10, and that under international law, every country is expected to get a score of 10. So any country that's not getting a score of 10 or is not really close to getting a score of 10, that means that they need to do better. And so while these categories can be useful, I do think it's important to note that anything below a 10 means that the country needs to do better. I'm going to scroll down once again. We see we have the overtime data, and once again, people at risk. And one thing that I think is really interesting about the qualitative data, as I was saying, was how rich it can be. And one of the things I find really interesting about this data right here, we have for assembly and association, and our respondent was able to give us really detailed specifics about informal sellers and like where the specific provinces that they are at risk and of facing a violation to assembly and association, and then also within the group of informal sellers, what specific subgroups of that group were at risk. So I really like the example because I think it shows you how rich the people at risk or the qualitative data for people at risk can be. I also want to take a moment and talk about the people at risk tab. So while these word clouds are amazing to look at, and you can just shift from one right to the next by using this arrow right here. As you can imagine, if you're trying to look at several different rights, it could get to be a lot. And so if you want to look at all these word clouds in one page, all you have to do is go to the People at Risk tab. So for the People at Risk tab, there are a couple of different ways that you could use this. You can just scroll through and look at the word cloud that we have for every country or for every right. Or you can pick a specific people group that you're interested in and see what, if our respondents identified them as being at particular risk for a given rate. So I am going to pick women and or girls. Just by scrolling through, for example, we can see that 40% of our respondents identified women and or girls as being at risk for facing a violation of the right to education. Keep scrolling down, 33% identified them as being at risk for a violation of the right to food. And as you keep scrolling down, you would be able to see what our respondents said for every right. So a really quick thing that I want to make note of is that just like in under safety from the state and under empowerment, after you saw the word cloud, you were able to see the qualitative data. You can do something similar here by clicking on show more information for survey respondents. And if you click that, you're able to see the qualitative data that we have for that right. So with that, I want to shift a little bit to talk about how you could look at how different countries perform on the same right. So I'm going to go up and go to rights. And then I'm going to select a right. I am going to do the right to be free from torture and ill treatment. So I'm going to click on that. So when I do that, I'm able to see how all countries that we have this data for, score on this right. So if I scroll down, I'd be able to see all the countries for which we have this data. I'm going to scroll back up, but there are a couple of different features that I'd like to bring to your attention. So the first is that you can look at a couple of different things. You can sort by score. You could also sort by name if you were interested in looking at countries in alphabetical order. You could also do population or GDP per capita. I'm going to keep us at scores. You can also do descending or ascending order. So right now we have it set on descending. So that means that the country with the highest score is at the top and the country with the lowest score is at the bottom. If I wanted to switch that, I could just click right here. And as you can see, now we have the country with the lowest score at the top and the country with the highest score at the bottom. I'm going to switch this back. Another option that you have is to look at countries in different years. So right now we're looking at countries' performances in 2020. But for example, if I was really interested in 2019, I could just click this back button and I'd be able to see the data for 2019. I'm going to switch this back to 2020. So another thing that I want to talk about in terms of interpreting these scores is some overlap that may exist between the uncertainty bands. So for example, as I discussed earlier, with uncertainty bands, what we say is that we believe that the score, for example, is 8.3, but we also believe that the true score could be anywhere between 7.4 and 9.2. So we see for Niue, we would say that the true score could be anywhere between 7.4 and 9.2. And for Guam, we would say that the true score could be anywhere between 6.9 and 8.5. Because there is overlap between these two uncertainty bands, we cannot definitively say that Niue is doing better than Guam. So even though 8.3 is a better score than 7.7, because there is overlap in the uncertainty bands, we cannot definitively say that Niue is doing better than Guam. However, we could say that Niue is doing better than Taiwan down here. And that is because there is no overlap between the two uncertainty bands. So we'd say the true score for Taiwan is between 6.3 and 6.9. The true score for Niue is between 7.4 and 9.2. And because there's no overlap, we can say that Niue is doing better at respecting the right to freedom from torture and ill treatment than Taiwan. Another couple of features that I would like to show you guys is being able to add a country filter. So if you were interested, for example, in a specific region, specific sub-region, a specific income group, a specific country group, or treaty ratification. So if you're interested in whether the country has ratified the ICCPR, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICSCR, or the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, you could choose one of these. I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to filter countries by region. So I'm going to select Sub-Saharan Africa. So as I mentioned earlier, we have data for 4 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. They are Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, and Mozambique. The big thing that I want to emphasize here is because there is overlap between all the country scores, we cannot say that any one country in the region is doing definitively better than another, but we can still get a sense of maybe one country doing slightly better than another. So with that, I want to transition to talking about looking at people groups, if that is all you're interested in. So let's say I'm not someone who does research on a particular right, nor am I someone who's interested in just one country. Instead, I'm someone who's interested in how one people group performs or experiences rights violations across the board. The way I would do that is by going up here to people, clicking on the down arrow, and then selecting that people group. So let's say I'm someone who is really interested in how women and/or girls face violations of human rights across the world. I could click down here on women and/or girls, and then I would be led to a page that goes into detail about all the countries that our human rights experts identified women and/or girls as being at particular risk for a specific right. So I can see this by region, and if I was really interested in, for example, Angola, I could click on Angola. It would take me to the People at Risk tab, and then I could scroll through and see, what percentage of our experts identified women and/or girls as being at risk for violation of a specific right. And if there was one right that they identified women and/or girls as being more at risk for than another. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand it over to Talia. Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Minna, and thank you, Tori. Those were fantastic, very clear explanations. But I am aware for all of you listening that there is an enormous amount of information on our rights tracker and a lot to get your head around. So we are very happy to go over any of that again, or more slowly, or for the country you are most interested in. So please do put your questions in the chat box. I'm going to invite you now, just before we carry on, to take 1 minute, 60 seconds to stretch, to grab a drink of water, to just close your eyes for a moment or breathe slowly. We're just going to take a minute, a short pause, and then we will carry on looking at some of the ways that you might find the rights tracker useful in your work. So take 1 minute. I'm going to turn my screen off and I encourage you to do the same, and we'll be back shortly. If some questions have come to you, then please do put them in the chat box. We are coming up quite soon to our question and answer portion of today's session. And we're very happy to go over things we've already talked about or answer more questions or clarify things. So please do put your questions in the chat box. The next thing that I'd like to show you is particularly for people who are focused on the human rights performance of governments in a particular country. When you go to your country page on the rights tracker, there is an option to download a PDF that summarizes all of the data. And that can be useful to send to a colleague or to print out and pass around at a meeting. Or to put as an appendix to advocacy communications. It's certainly recommended to put in as an appendix for universal periodic review communications, for instance. So I'll just show you where that button is. So if, for instance, we're looking at the United States page, we're on the At a Glance tab, and there's this little button here that says Download PDF. So all you do is click on that, and it will download a PDF for you that will look a little bit like this. So it will have a picture background, and it has all of the at a glance bar charts on the front. It's printable or shareable. And I'm just going to hand over to Tori now to talk about how you can use Hermi data in a UPR submission.
Thanks, Talia. So the UPR prioritizes firsthand information, firsthand observations. So if you're submitting a stakeholder report to the UPR, you mostly will emphasize what you yourself have observed. But by including secondhand information, you can support your observations and really reinforce your message. So by using Hermi data, you can complement your findings, and you can include very specific examples from our rights tracker, such as our scores on specific rights, including the indicator rights or indicator scores below those, our sex disaggregated data, the people at risk data. So our rights tracker is really useful there for specific examples. You can also use our data to provide high-level context. So you can prove that what you're observing is not an aberration, but it is part of a broader trend. So then you can also just make your submission more persuasive by including data. And as Talia just showed you, you can print out the country PDF, and you can use that as an annex to your submission. Talia, do you want to go to the next slide?
Sure.
So our data can also be useful for the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, our civil and political rights data would be really useful for Goal 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, where there are not very many indicators to prove progress for that. And then also our economic and social rights have really strong and direct links with the indicators used to measure progress for the SDGs. A lot of our economic and social rights use the exact same indicators that they would use to see progress with Sustainable Development Goals. Earlier, Talia shared a link that should be in the chat box, but if it's not, we can reshare it to an article that we have on specific examples of how Hermi relates to the SDGs. And at the bottom of that article, there's a chart which shows you the indicators that we use that are the same as the indicators used for the SDGs. So you can see where there are really, really direct links. Also, because our scores take income into account, you can use them to distinguish between countries that are performing poorly because they're not using their resources well, versus countries that are doing their very best, but would need additional income to improve their performance. Then our over time graph can show progress to show that countries are getting closer to meeting those SDG goals. And then finally, our people at risk information can highlight, for example, gender inequities and vulnerable groups. So you can use our rights tracker to show which rights specific groups of people are more vulnerable to abuses from or violations from. And then also, as Mena showed, the qualitative data below the word clouds gives very specific contextual examples, which again, you can include to talk about the people who are most at risk or the situations in which people would be more at risk of violations of their rights.
And so now we'll hand over to Mena to talk a little bit about our data on the effect of COVID-19 on human rights.
Yes, thank you, Talia. So in the past survey for looking at countries' performance on human rights in 2020, we were able to include questions asking our respondents to consider how COVID-19 impacted human rights. And so we have been able to compile those findings in a report that will be shared in the chat box. But overall, I would say that this report provides a lot of insight, both into the overall trends that COVID-19 had on human rights, but then also on specific groups of people that were particularly impacted by COVID-19 and how it impacted their ability to have their human rights respected. Another thing that we're able to talk about with the rights tracker is gender. And I know this is something that a lot of people are really interested in. And there's a variety of ways that the rights tracker, and Hermi in general, is able to provide useful data to understanding the intersection between gender and human rights. So one of the ways that we do this is we have separate male and female scores for 3 rights. They are the right to education, the right to food, and the right to health. This was something that Tori went over when she was talking about the quality of life tab. But if you have any questions, we are happy to kind of show you again how you'd be able to see that data. Another way that the rights tracker is able to show you useful data when it comes to gender is that for countries that we are running the survey in, we also note where women and or girls are at particular risk. So as I showed a little bit earlier, you can always go under the people tab and look at countries where women and or girls were at particular risk. And we're happy to show that again as well. Finally, under the quality of life tab for the right to health, one of our Hermi scores is reproductive health. And so if this is a particular subfield of kind of women's rights or gender and human rights that you're interested in, we do have that score, and we are once again happy to show you how you would be able to see the reproductive health score for a country. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Talia.
Thank you very much, Minna and Tori. We've had several questions come through the chat box, and we have time for more, so please do keep them coming. The first question that I think we haven't addressed yet comes from Aditi in India. Aditi has just joined the Hermi team recently to be our India and South Asia coordinator, so it's wonderful to have you with us today, Aditi. So Aditi is asking about those sex disaggregated data. So let me show you. I'm just going to go back to your question, go over again how to read the gender disaggregated scores for the quality of life rights. So I will take you to the rights tracker, and we'll have a look at that for any country that you choose. But if it's Aditi, perhaps we'll look at India. So I'll share my screen. And are you seeing my rights tracker? Excellent. So let's go to India as an example. So the sex disaggregated data we have is for our economic and social rights, and we have it for any of the rights for which those data are collected under female and male by the countries or by the international organisations that are collecting the data that we draw on. So we can produce it if the underlying data are available, but things are not separated into male and female for everything in all of the databases. So we go to quality of life, and we scroll down a little bit past these main scores to where we see full details. And then you go a little bit further and you see by sex. So we can look at a few different things by sex, disaggregated by sex, and this is the list. You can look at the right to primary education, secondary education, the right to food, and the right to child health and adult health. All of those things, the international organisations that collect the raw data collect it disaggregated by male and female. So if we go to primary education, for instance, we can see a score here that is purely for female children in India. So it's taking out all of the boys and just looking at the Indian government's performance for girls. Now, this is not comparing girls to boys. It's not saying more girls are in school than boys. That may or may not be true. It's saying for India's performance for girls compared to every other country's performance for girls and every other country at that income level, how well is India doing? And we see that when you compare India's performance for girls with the rest of the world, India is doing a little bit better than it is when we ask how is India doing for boys compared to how other countries are doing in meeting their obligations for boys. Aditi, does that answer your question? Feel free to ask further questions in the chat box. And what other questions do we have? Okay, Cece suggesting that we talk about the hypothetical questions in the survey. This is a really good question. So it may be that some of you have participated in our survey. I know we have a lot of people here from survey countries, and maybe you will be asked to in the future. And so I thought I would explain one of the interesting features of our survey design that helps us to produce accurate data that can be compared across time and across countries. So if I ask 3 of you from the same country, in 2020, last year, how often did government people like police and military, how often did government people torture people in your country? And I ask you to tell me on a scale of from it never happened to it happened all the time. Somewhere on that scale, you're going to give me an answer. Now, 3 people might give me very different answers, even though they have exactly the same facts available to them. So someone might be someone who is quite optimistic, and so they might put all of their answers this way. Someone might be feeling like things have got a lot worse and they're feeling bad about things, and they put them all down this way. Some people might always use the middle of the scales whenever they answer a question. Some people might go right to the end. So the way that we figure out how to put all of your information together and how to understand how you have understood the question is that, as well as asking you about what happened in your country, we ask you about what happened in 3 fictional countries that we've made up and we tell you about. And those 3 countries we describe to everyone around the world in every country that has the survey. And so we ask you about your country and you say things are okay or things are terrible. Then we describe 3 countries to you. We say in country A, people are frequently tortured, they're beaten, they have electric shock treatment, they don't get let out of prison, there's sleep deprivation, and this happens all the time. So we're telling you about a country that is clearly terrible. There's no ambiguity. And then we say, how about country B? In country B, everyone treats each other really well, and prisoners are never tortured. And so we're clearly telling you about a country where things are wonderful and it should be getting a really high score. And then we tell you about a country in between. So we just describe these countries in only 2 or 3 sentences. It's just designed to be very clear. And we ask you the same question about those fictional made-up countries as we ask you about your country. So we say, so knowing what you know about countries A, B, and C, what would you say? How often in 2020 did government agents torture people? And so you will give your answers on the same scale. Now, if you are a person who never uses the ends of the scale, and for the country that's terrible, the made-up country, you put it in the middle, then that tells us something about what you're saying about your own country if you have your own country score to some side of that. So that's how we are able to moderate everyone's answers, put them on the same scale, and produce statistics, produce scores that are going to be comparable between different people across different years. From one year to the next, we'll have different people giving different answers, and across different countries. There is one other important function of the fictional countries, or the anchoring vignettes, as they're technically known. If you answer those questions and you tell us that the terrible country was fine and that the great country was bad, if you get the answers in the wrong order for these 3 made-up countries, then we are going to conclude that you are not paying attention right now. And so we will not be able to use the answer you gave for your country on this page of the survey. So it's not there to catch people out or test you, but if you're not reading the questions clearly and not giving sensible answers, we do need to know that, because you want to be able to use data that is reliable for your country. So it's really important that survey respondents read the questions about their own country and about the made-up countries and give thoughtful answers about them so that we can produce the best data that will be the most useful to human rights communities around the world. What other questions does anybody have? If I've missed a question in the chat box, feel free to draw my attention to it again. I think someone, do you have your hand up? If you have your hand up, I'm not able to see what your name is. Do feel free to just ask your question aloud. So there's somebody whose name says Infinix Smart 5. So I don't know how to address you otherwise, but can you please just ask your question? Just unmute yourself. Cece, I'll ask you to send that person a message. Oh, no, I think he might have. Could you just send him a private message to draw his attention? Because I'd love to hear his question. He just needs to unmute himself. And in the meantime, another question's come through the chat box. How do you become a respondent in the survey? That's a really good question. So in each country where we run the survey, we appoint a volunteer Hermi ambassador to coordinate respondents for the survey to reach out to a variety of human rights experts, and they get things started, although we've been going for several years now, so there are a lot of people involved who didn't come directly through the ambassadors. And then anybody who is eligible to do the survey, and I'll speak in a moment about who is eligible, anyone who's eligible is then also able to invite other eligible people. And so if you get sent a survey link, you are then welcome to say, oh, well, actually, I have a colleague who's a specialist in women's rights, and I think they would be great to ask, and we will invite them to participate also. Cece, you can let me know if you think in the chat box if there's other things that I should mention about the survey. Cece runs all of our survey engagement. Just to talk about who is eligible to participate in the survey, we are looking for people who have first-hand knowledge of human rights violations and of the human rights situation in a country. The usual categories of people that we are thinking of are, for instance, human rights monitors at NGOs. So if you work for Amnesty in a country, or for a press freedom organisation, or a local NGO that's all about human rights, then we want to know what you think about what's going on in your country. And the second category is journalists. So any journalist who covers issues to do with politics and social issues will have really good knowledge that we would love to have access to. Unless you are only a sports journalist or only a theatre critic, then pretty much any kind of journalist will, I think, have a good range of knowledge and be able to give useful information. The third category is human rights lawyers. So if you represent people who experience human rights violations, either because you go to court about those violations or because you represent people who are involved in the justice system, and so you're well aware of how people are treated in prison, for instance, then we would love to hear from you. And the fourth category is if you are in a country that has a fully independent national human rights institution, and we have a technical definition for that independence, it's an A status under the Paris Principles, then staff at that institution are also welcome to participate. Now, our friend whose name I don't know, who says Infinix Smart 5, you who had your hand up, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question? I'm afraid I can't hear you because you're muted. You are muted, so I can't hear you. You'll need to unmute or type your question. I'm sorry, I can't hear you because you're muted. If anybody knows that gentleman whose name I don't know because the screen name is his device, then please pass on some information. And I see some raised hands. Terry Kisukulu, please unmute yourself and speak if you'd like to.
Talia, good morning. I'm calling you from DRC in Kinshasa. Yes, of course, from Kinshasa in DRC. I have a couple of questions, no? And the first one is, you know, because myself have been involved in this kind of of studies for many years, and I know how challenging it is to measure human rights, especially in a country such as DRC, where there is political issues, where we are under wars and the conflict anyway. How do you sample your studies, your research? Where do you focus? In which zones do you focus your survey? Where do you conduct your survey? Because in DRC, we have this Western party. We have Eastern party and the Western party. In Kinshasa, where there is no war. And probably you people can conduct study in Kinshasa or other party where there is no conflicts, and come up with conclusions such as the situation are okay. But those who are conducting studies or researches in east of DRC, North Kivu and South Kivu, Ituri and other parts of DRC, where people are killed every day, they have another meaning. They can come up with other findings, So my question is, where do you focus? Where do you conduct your surveys? In Kinshasa, over the country? How do you sample it? Yeah, that's my question.
Merci Thierry, that's a very good question, thank you. So our survey is done online, and the recruiting is done by email. So anyone can participate from anywhere in the country. So we don't have a base in Kinshasa, and are only asking people in Kinshasa. It's very important to us. Two things. One, to invite a range of people to be involved in the survey, and then to ask them to ask a range of people to be recruited. And so the ambassador in each country has a responsibility to work on diversity, which includes geographic diversity. And so it will be important. So we are very well aware of the importance of asking people in different parts of the country. And the second thing is that we only want people to, one of the main groups of people that we want to participate is people who are involved in monitoring themselves. And so we would want someone, for instance, who is based in Kinshasa, but whose job it is to be monitoring things in other parts of the country, so that they will be drawing on knowledge about all of the country. So that's very important, that we're not just sampling people on the street. We're not just asking for lay people to tell us what they think. We're asking for experts to feed their knowledge into our modeling so that we can come up with a number that represents the knowledge within the country. I think you had a second question, Thierry?
Too good. That's okay. Good question. Thank you. Good answer. Thank you.
Right, and back to our friend in the blue suit. Again, you'll have to unmute. I'm sorry, I had to mute you before because of feedback. No, I'm sorry, I can't hear you yet. Can you unmute?
I was saying it's okay. I'm satisfied with your answer. Thank you.
Well, I'll go to Kenneth, and then I think there's another question in the chat box. And if this participant is able to unmute, then I'm going to go straight to him when he does, and just interrupt if that's all right. Kenneth.
Oh, hi, thank you, Talia. Thank you, people from Hermi. I'm actually, the SWARAM is actually the Malaysia Human Rights Organization. I'm the—
Kenneth, can I interrupt you just because—
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Yeah, brilliant. Hello, our friend in a blue jacket. Please ask your question. Please go ahead. If anyone else is a colleague of this person and can tell me his name, then that will perhaps help our communication. Hello, do you have a question? I'm sorry for the difficulties. We'll come back to you. Kenneth, sorry.
Yeah, so basically it was just, my name is Kenneth. I'm the SORAM's documentation and monitoring officer. So basically it fits into what Talia has been talking about, the first criteria of the people that you're looking for. And actually it's not much of a question, but very much of accepting your invitation to work together on this, because from SORAM's side, we already have like almost more than 10 years of data of documenting like people being detained without trial, people was being tortured, death in custody, extrajudicial killing, and all this. So in fact, I'll drop my email here after this conversation. I would very much look forward to work on that. And I think SORAM would have no problem sharing with you with the data and all this. And in exchange, we would like to know more about the methodology in deep details that we want to, because it would be great value to SORAM, my organization itself, to have something like that, because incidentally, SORAM is also the core secretariat to the UPR process, representing the civil society. So on behalf of people of Malaysian and all the level of human rights in my country, we thank you for what brilliant work that Hermi has done. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Kenneth. That's so kind. Appreciate your kind words. I've put my email address in the chat box and I'll be putting it on screen later. And Cece, who runs our survey, she's also Malaysian herself. She would love to be in touch with you. So yeah, I look forward to working further together. I see a couple more questions. How to become a respondent in your survey? If the survey is operating in your country, then speaking with your country's ambassador would be the way to go. Tori, would you mind putting a link to our Hermi team page in the box, and then that will explain who the ambassador is in your country. A question, can you discuss some of the considerations that go into using perception data as opposed to some other kind of data to analyze these characteristics? Oh, that's a really good question. It's a technical one, and I can give a technical answer in the chat box later. We have an article, an academic article that explains why we use this kind of survey and why we think it gives better information than other methods, particularly because we use the anchoring vignettes, the fictional countries that I discussed before. We're getting pretty accurate results. We use a sophisticated statistical technique that you may be familiar with, the Bayesian Aldrich-McKelvey model. Looking at it, it's a latent variable model. So there's quite a lot of literature on that. It's been peer reviewed. So either when I next stop speaking, or perhaps Tori or Cece will drop in the links to our peer reviewed articles that will give you a bit more information for those of you who are interested in the technicalities. Kevin, question about the respondents. Political bias and reducing risk of manipulation. Yes, absolutely. So you're not allowed to participate if you're involved in the government. So that's the first thing. And certainly it's possible that someone might just decide to lie, but they do have to be signed up with us. It's not, so the survey is anonymous when you take it, but you get sent a link having given us your email address to say that you want to participate. And so you do have to have some, you'd have to go to quite a lot of lengths to manipulate the data. And then also the statistical model is designed to pick up anomalies. So we probably would notice strangely manipulative answers. So far, it doesn't seem to have been a problem as we have gone through and checked our results with people in the countries as they come out each year. But yes, it's certainly something that is on our minds. I see you've raised your hand and perhaps have a follow-up question. Feel free.
Right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Hi, Talia. Hi, Hermi, and everybody online. The reason I raised my hand is because I have had a little experience with human rights work. I live in the UK, but I come from Sierra Leone. I worked at the Special Court for Sierra Leone a few years ago now. I've been in Rwanda, and I've been on a mission to Lebanon in 2006, post the bombing. And the reason I asked the question about manipulation and so on and so forth is because I understand from the inside that sometimes one deals with people who work for non-governmental organizations, so to speak, but effectively they are arms of the government's publicity machine. And I was just wondering how, obviously on an international basis, I know my country, other people may know their country, how do you avoid that bias? Because people in certain regimes will do their best to raise their human rights index because it directly relates to funding that they get from donor countries.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The way that we try to mitigate the risks of that kind of behaviour by having a process that where we go through ambassadors and trusted partners and have a snowball recommendation-based recruitment. So when someone says, how do we sign up? I don't have a link I can send you that says anyone who wants to sign up can sign up. That's not how it works. And so we have a filtering system using local ambassadors. It's not impossible that someone could get in, but we so far have not observed that problem in the 4 years that we've been doing it. And I think that the good news in terms of the system seems to be working so far is that we do operate in a range of countries. Like right from the beginning, we've had a very broad range of countries that we've run the survey in, from every continent and of every income level, and everywhere on the spectrum of democracy. And so, for instance, we've been running the survey in Vietnam and Saudi Arabia since the very beginning, and so we feel like we've managed to collect useful data, even from very hostile and closed countries. But it's something that's on our mind every year, and it's we review our processes and continually improve them. And if you or anyone else have an interest in meeting with us further to discuss them and sharing any ideas you have, or if you have suggestions about how to make the process more robust, then we are very, very keen to hear your suggestions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just looking through the chat box, and I suspect I've missed the odd question, so do feel free to draw my attention to anything. Thank you for your feedback, Jose, about Angola. The survey process. The survey is long and complicated and difficult, and we acknowledge that, we know that. In order to produce robust data, we have to do more than just ask a few quick questions and move on. And so the survey does take at least an hour to complete, probably longer for most people if they want to give extra information. We hope that people who do it, realise that it's an investment in better data for their own country. So far, we think that that's how people are seeing it. It's not an enjoyable experience, but it only happens once a year, and it does contribute to everything that's available on the rights tracker to be used by the whole human rights community to improve people's lives. Certainly, we are aware that one significant problem of it being an online survey is that internet connections are variable around the world, and we're really aware of that. Half of our survey countries are actually Pacific Islands, who almost universally have very poor internet. So it's really on our minds, and we have made many changes over the years to try and make things easier and better, and we have more plans to try and make it easier and better, and we work to make the survey shorter every year as well, although I'm sure no one believes us when we say that, because it always feels very long when you do it. But we have cut questions this year for next year, so we hope that it will be significantly shorter and easier to do next year. Thanks. Please do keep your feedback coming in on the survey on anything else. So we've come to the end of our time, but I'm very happy to stay and answer more questions. But I will just say thank you to all of you for coming and for asking excellent questions and giving useful feedback and thoughts and comments. We'll stop recording now. Cece will stop the recording, but the team will remain to discuss anything further.